can grab the notes in the center right there? Yeah. You weren't here. This will like be actually real for you. It's fake for everybody else. Okay. 3 big ideas we're talking about when we're sampling. The first is that we are looking at a part of a whole. And so this drawing that I have over here on the whiteboard is sort of my explanation for that. It's not practical to talk to every member of the population. So what we create is a sampling frame where we would draw members of that population. And those members that we draw are called a sample. Okay? So this big thing that is, awkwardly drawn, that's the population. And it's awkwardly drawn because a population, we don't know a lot of things about the population, right? We don't necessarily know the exact size of it. We don't know where they all are. It's very organic in that way, okay? So that's why it's got all wavy and stuff. That's there for a purpose. That's the population. It's something large, like all U.S. adults, all right? That's the population. Or all high school students. That's the population. The sampling frame is a square inside of it because it is a constructed set of people we are looking at. Okay, it is all of the people we might possibly measure. Okay, so if my population was all U.S. adults, my sampling frame might be U.S. adults that go to this website, right? Because they go to this website, and then those are the only people that might get asked the question to be measured. Okay? Might be U.S. adults who watch this news channel, right? Because those are all of the people that might see the question to be measured. So the sampling frame is all the people that might be measured, and the sample are the actual people measured. Like, I did a poll. All U.S. adults were the population that I want to apply things to. I only called people in Ohio. So that the U.S. adults in Ohio are my sampling frame, and then these specific adults in Ohio were the ones that I actually called and got measurements from. So it's kind of this 3-tip thing. Population is the big entity that I'm drawing from. It's the big entity that I'm applying things to. Sampling frame are the specific people I am drawing from. The sample is the actual people that I have drawn. Questions, comments, concerns on that idea? And it's a big idea, and it's difficult sometimes to wrap our brains around that this small sample of people can represent the entire population, but it can't. It's like the book, the example they use in the book where you're eating soup, right? You don't need to eat the entire pot of soup to know what the soup tastes like. As long as you get a representative sample of that soup, you know what the soup tastes like. You stir up the soup, and all you need is a spoonful, and you know what the soup tastes like. You don't have to have half the pot of soup to be like, now I know what it tastes like. You just need a spoonful of soup. The soup has to be well randomized. It has to be stirred, right? Good, I'm glad. I didn't write it, so I'd love to take credit for it, but I didn't. Sample surveys, those are the ways that it's just where you ask questions of small groups. I don't want to spend a lot of time on that. Let's talk more about bias. If we over or underemphasize characteristics of a population, that sample is said to be biased. It is the one thing that you have to avoid when you're gathering data, because if data is biased, there is no way to fix it. There's no way to do anything with it. You can spend hundreds of thousands of dollars getting a big sample of people, doing research to get a big sample of people, but if you find out that it's biased, all of your research is going to be kaput. It's not worth anything. Because biased samples, you can't do anything with it. Okay? So you want to avoid bias. Best way to avoid bias is to select individuals at random. Randomness helps get rid of that bias. And yeah, this idea right here, deliberately using randomness, is one of the big ideas. In fact, that's the big idea of this entire unit that we're talking about here, is the deliberate use of randomness, not thinking of randomness as something unpredictable, using randomness as a tool in order to do good statistics. Types of bias. So there's lots of different ways that we can get bias. There's response bias. That refers to bias that results from problems in the measurement process. Examples of response bias. A leading question, right? A leading question is a type of response bias. And what a leading question does is the wording of the question may be loaded in some way to unduly favor one response over another. For example, a satisfaction survey may ask the respondent to indicate where she is satisfied, dissatisfied, or very dissatisfied. By giving the respondent one response option to express satisfaction and two response options to express dissatisfaction, the survey's question is biased towards getting a dissatisfied response. If I have three ways to answer it, and two of them indicate one thing and one of them indicates the other, you're more likely to get the one that has two. Again, for example, I go to a restaurant, okay, and on that restaurant, have you guys ever seen, like, you've been at a restaurant and they have like a little piece of paper in the center, like, rate us? How did we do? That kind of thing. Have you guys seen that? If on those little slips of paper it's like, how did we do? Did we do great? Did we do fantastic? Or did we not do real well? Well, you're given three options. Maybe they didn't do fantastic, but they did okay, and so you're going to put the middle one that says great, right? By not giving appropriate options to measure their satisfaction, you're going to see something. You're going to have less people say that they're dissatisfied if they're just randomly treating that random. Okay. The other way that you can get a leading question is that you can start off by writing the question in a way that makes you sound like a terrible person if you don't agree. For example, you could write a question. Let's say we're talking about the amount of space in a landfill that diapers use. Okay. If you wrote your question saying, every year diapers consume 553,000 cubic feet of landfill space every year. Given this information, are you for or against cloth diapers, right? By giving this information in the beginning that is very anti-disposable diapers, you are therefore leading people to choose a certain answer. Okay? You're saying you're a terrible person if you use disposable diapers because look at all the space that they're taking. Are you for cloth diapers? Well, I don't want to be a terrible person, so I'm going to say yes, that I'm for. Yeah. If you balance it, that's okay, right? But that's hard to do. Like, it's really hard to make it sound balanced when you're writing a question like that, because, well, I mean, if you're giving an even response, yes, it's okay. But yeah, just as a forewarning that is difficult. It is very difficult to get those things balanced. So, but you are leading people to a certain response, right? So that could be a leading question because you're guiding their responses. Okay. By the way, in the video, because I was just randomly spouting off crap and I didn't actually think about the example I used it, I talked about toddlers being shot in the face. So it's like it was a gun control question. My response was about toddlers being shot in the face, and I'm kind of glad maybe that I went a different direction with this one because and that you guys didn't hear that one. Well, yeah, I mean, I had to say it. What's that? I am recording this too, yeah. So I mean, but at least I didn't talk about it. I mean, in the video I talked about it for like 5 minutes. It was like a 5-minute example of me talking about it. Yeah. The microphone's on. I turned. Look, that says on right there. I flipped the switch. Okay, the other type of response bias is called social, or another type. I shouldn't say the other type. I should say another type. Another type is called social desirability. And that is that most people will like to present themselves in a favorable light, so they will be reluctant to admit unsavory attitudes or illegal attitudes in a survey, particularly if the survey results are not confidential. Instead, their responses may be biased towards what they believe is socially desirable. So when you give questionnaires about drug and alcohol use, when you give questionnaires about other, taboo type subjects, things that people don't like talking about, usually like things about sex end up being in there. Those kind of subjects, you have this element of social desirability. Sometimes you will answer the questions to make yourself seem better than you may actually be. Okay, and we have to keep that in mind when we're talking about bias. One way that shows up in a big way that you guys would have experience with is the Healthy Youth Survey. You guys remember taking the Healthy Youth Survey as sophomores? Yes. We do it as sophomores and seniors, so you guys will take it again this year. It was like a 80 question survey that you got that talked about drug use and alcohol use. What's that? It was a long survey. I know you guys did it, and you did it your sophomore year. We do it every year, sophomores and seniors. I thought it was sophomores, but you should know. But anyway, the Healthy Youth Survey asks high school students about their alcohol use, their drug use, their sexual activity, all of these things that make up a healthy youth. And we gather those statistics so that we know what the growing problems are in our high school, right? Like, how bad of an alcohol problem do we have amongst our students? How bad of a drug problem do we have amongst our students? What's that? There will be some bias in that, so that we do have to be careful with those results. Even though this is confidential and we don't actually ask you to put your name on it, there will be some tendency for teens to either not report how much alcohol they actually drink because they don't want to report drinking alcohol, or B, to over-report how much they drink because they think it's funny. Right? And they actually, in the Healthy Youth Survey, they actually have controls in place to see it for the people that are being funny. Because some of the questions are like, have you ever used marijuana before? And then it's like, yes or no. And then it's like, have you ever used cocaine before? And then it'll say yes or no. And then it'll be like, have you ever used horse tranquilizers before? And it'll be like, yes or no. And then they'll totally just make something up. They'll be like, have you used glitter dust before? And like, the people who are hitting yes to that question, okay, they're probably just screwing around because they're just making up answers, right? And there's always like 10, 15% of respondents that are like, yeah, I use glitter dust all the time. It's a daily part of my regime. But I don't know. Is that an actual drug? It might be a drug. I don't know. No, so they don't use glitter dust, right? But they use some kind of like totally fake, made up drug just to see if there are people who are screwing around and just marking those off. And so they kind of try and control that bias a little bit, but yeah. So anyway, there is an element of social desirability, so you have to be careful with those kind of surveys, right? Even though they're anonymous, high school students will still make up answers on there. Now, and if you had to imagine you had to put your name on it, right? If you had to put your name on the top that said this is Devin Willard's survey, and then it was like, have you used marijuana before? And Devin's like, well, my name's on this. I'm going to write no. How much alcohol do you drink weekly? Well, 0, because my name's on this and I don't want that to come out. And have you ever used glitter dust before? No way. Glitter dust is the worst drug ever, so I'm not going to use that. So if your name's on it, you're definitely not going to answer the question truthfully, because you don't want that social element to mess with you. Other types of bias. I'm going to put both of these up at the same time because they're actually they're very similar. There's under coverage and there's non-response. So under coverage occurs when some members of the population are inadequately represented in the sample. Non-response is when individuals chosen for the sample are unwilling or unable to participate in the sample. Those are very similar type responses, and sometimes under coverage, sometimes non-response, these two get confused a lot, is what I'm trying to say here. Under coverage, a good example of under coverage, this was in the 1936 presidential election, a magazine article went out, Literary Digest, to see who was going to win the 1936 presidential election. And according to that survey, Alfred Landon was going to win by a landslide, right? It wasn't even a contest. And that he would beat Franklin Roosevelt. And then we all know, we've never heard of Alfred Landon before, but we've probably all heard of Franklin Roosevelt, I hope. And so we know Franklin Roosevelt obviously won that presidential election. And so why was this sample so wrong? Well, low-income voters who typically vote Democrat were not well represented in that sample, right? Literary Digest wasn't a thing that low-income voters typically subscribed to every month, right? And so they weren't being well represented. You had a lot of very rich old white people answering the survey, and rich old white people tend to vote Republican. So Alfred Landon, they thought Alfred Landon was going to win because they were rich and old and white, and everything they do was correct. But the survey was obviously underrepresenting the low-income voters, and so Roosevelt ended up winning that one significantly because low-income voters were part of that, right? This survey suffered from undercoverage, right? The sample was overemphasizing the high-income voters and underrepresenting the low-income voters. Okay, that's undercoverage. It did not adequately represent the U.S. population. It was underrepresenting the low-income voters. Non-response bias is very similar. Non-response bias means that they couldn't respond, right? They were in the sampling frame, but they couldn't respond. So same thing, right? The respondents tended to be Landon supporters, and the non-respondents, people who could not respond because they don't sit in their leather chairs smoking cigars, reading Literary Digest every evening. They couldn't respond because they were low income. They didn't have the magazine. And so, since only 25% of sample voters actually completed the mail-in survey, the results were overestimated for Landon. Simply put, the difference between undercoverage and non-response. Undercoverage results with a problem in your sampling frame. Okay, to use the Literary Digest example, their sampling frame did not include low-income voters, right? So the Literary Digest members were in the sampling frame. And low-income voters were not in the sampling frame at all, okay? Non-response happens when these people are in the sampling frame, but can't respond. Like, we wanted to put them in there, we wanted to represent them, but they physically could not respond. Like, there was no way to get a response from them. Or they didn't want to respond. Like, we put the survey in Literary Digest and Highlights magazine. Just trying to think of a low-income magazine that they might get. We put it in Cosmo and Literary Digest. But the people who read Cosmo didn't submit their answers as much, right? So they were in the sampling frame, but they didn't put their responses in. They were non-respondents. Does that make sense? It's a very discrete difference. Okay. This is when they're not in the sampling frame. This is when they're in it but don't respond. It's kind of weird. Questions, comments, concerns on that? Any clarifications we can make here? Okay. I think there's like one more type of bias, two more types of bias. Voluntary response bias happens when inside of a voluntary sample, examples are like call-in radio shows that solicit audience participation in surveys or controversial topics. They tend to overrepresent the people with strong opinions. So if it's a call-in show and to get your respondents, you have to actually call a number to do it. That's called voluntary response because people that don't care that much are not going to pick up the phone and be like, yeah, I don't care. Okay, and then, the people who do it are going to pick up the phone, they're going to call, and then they're going to scream at the person because it's something that they're really advocating against, right? People who just don't care that much, they're not going to pick up the phone. You also get the problem of your audience, right? If you're looking, so let's take like the example of abortion, okay? Because we want to keep it light. If you were to do a Fox News poll about whether or not you're pro-choice or pro-life, you're going to get vastly different results than if you were to do an MSNBC poll about whether you're pro-choice or pro-life. Does that make sense? Because your audiences are very different and have much different opinions. The likelihood is that on the Fox poll, you're going to have a lot more people that are pro-life than pro-choice. Because, again, Fox News tends to be a very Republican base for news. If you're watching MSNBC, it's probably going to go the other way. It's probably going to be more pro-life than pro-choice because MSNBC tends to have more Democratic votes. More pro-life than pro-choice for Fox. More pro-choice than pro-life for MSNBC. Sorry if I messed that up. Because Fox tends to be more Republican and MSN tends to be more Democrat. You get vastly different results just because of the audience, right? The people who are willing to call in, because they have strong opinions about it, are different in those two things. So voluntary response bias. In general, anytime you have a survey that is a voluntary response on a website, on a TV show, on a radio show, you should always take those results with a grain of salt. Always. Because the audience that they're reaching is totally different, right? If you go to, there was a website that was like vaccineinfo.org, right? And it's a website that is devoted to how vaccines are terrible. And they did a participation survey about basically what your thoughts on vaccines were. And surprise, surprise, they said that most people think vaccines are terrible. Well, that's because people who like vaccines and think vaccines are fantastic don't go to vaccineinfo.org because they think they're not vaccines, right? So you have to be careful of your audience, right? And then I think this is the last one, convenient samples bias. We simply include the individuals who are convenient. Unfortunately, this group may not be representative of the population. Convenience sampling is not only a problem for students or the other beginning samplers. In fact, it's a widespread problem for the business world because the easiest people for a company to sample are its own customers. Let's go back to the restaurant example, right? If I pick up that little "How did I do" form to fill it out to talk about my service that day, and I put on and then say, how do you like the food at Olive Garden? Well, you're not going to get a lot of people that say Olive Garden sucks because I just ate there, right? And I went there with a purpose. I went to Olive Garden because I like Olive Garden, and I wouldn't write down your food sucks because I wouldn't go there if I thought their food sucked. So you have to be careful of your businesses make this mistake all the time because they survey their customers, and they're customers of them for a reason because they prefer their service over somebody else. Very rarely do you find, well, actually, I shouldn't say very rarely. There are specific instances where there are businesses that, when they survey their own customers, get negative results, right? Specifically, you see that in cell phone companies because nobody likes their cell phone service, and internet providers because nobody likes internet providers because cell phone companies and internet providers are all crap. So those would be kind of like the antis where you would see asking your own customers to find out that you're terrible. But for the most part, right, when businesses ask their customers, they tend to get positive results. The way that you guys would see this, if you had to do a sample for something and you were to just get online and go to your Facebook page and be like, hey, how many of you guys are pro gun control and how many guys are anti-gun control? The fact is that every one of us would probably get very different results because your friends tend to share the same opinion, right? If I were to ask a question on my Facebook page about gun control, the likelihood is that I'm going to get a lot of responses that are like my opinion. Because the people that I tend to engage with the most are the people that tend to share the same opinion. Maybe not in all cases and maybe not exactly, but the tendency is out of my 600 friends on Facebook, out of my 600 friends on Facebook, probably 500 of them have similar opinions, right? And it's not because I'm a terrible person, it's just because you tend to associate people with people that have the same opinion. And to associate with people who are like you. And that's bad for sampling because you're going to get results that confirm that you're correct because you wouldn't have it because of, that. Okay, I don't want to talk about this. Randomizing is good, right? It protects us from bias. Boop, boop, boop. Blaine, you'll have to fill these in with somebody else. This is an interesting one. It's the sample size. It's not how large the population is. This is the one that is totally not intuitive. It doesn't matter how big your population is. You can do it with the same size. So all U.S. adults, if I do my sampling correctly, I can get an accurate measurement of all U.S. adults with 500 people, right? And that doesn't change if there's 100,000 people or 10 million people. 100 people is still going to, if I do it right, 100 to 500 can be an accurate representation of those. It doesn't matter how big your population is. It matters how big your sample is. We will learn more about that in the future, about how big something has to be. But the big idea here is that no matter how big the population is, 100,000 people, 1,000 people, 10 million people, the sample size is the thing that matters, not how big the population is. 100 people can represent 1,000 people just as well as 100 people can represent 10 million people. That's a weird thing to think about, but it's true. And that's what we're doing with the sample. Okay, so is there anything about the three ideas about biases that we want to talk about? Go ahead, Hannah. You do your best. Sometimes, like it said in the instructions on the problems from last night, sometimes you're going to read it and you write down possible ideas if you can see them, but if you don't see them, you just write, I didn't see anything, right? In general, the questions in the book tend to be a bit more vague than AP questions. AP questions tend to be very concise, and they're looking, so what you read in the book last night on those questions will not be the kind of thing that you see on the AP test, right? On the AP test, they'll ask you what kind of sampling was being employed here, and they'll have a description, a very concise description of what's going on, right? The ones that in the book, they want you to analyze and think a lot, and so they tend to be a bit more vague. Okay, I'm going to cut it off here. And just really quick.